The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, a frozen hell where over 2 million men were fed into a meat grinder. And the grinder didn't stop turning. By late 1942, the city of Stalingrad had become a brutal symbol of pride, power, and total war. Located on the banks of the Volga River, the city wasn't just a strategic target, it was a psychological one. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad meant breaking Soviet morale. For Stalin, defending it was a matter of national survival. What unfolded was not a battle. It was a siege by fire, ice, and flesh. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, stormed into the city with overwhelming force. Backed by tanks, artillery, and airstrikes, they expected a swift victory. But the Soviets didn't retreat. They dug in, block by block, room by room, turning every building into a fortress, every basement into a battlefield. Stalingrad became a city of snipers, ambushes, and hand-to-hand combat. Grenades were thrown over stairwells. Machine guns echoed through apartment blocks. Entire divisions vanished in what veterans later described as urban slaughter. And amidst the rubble, civilians. Tens of thousands who couldn't escape. Families froze, starved, or were buried alive under the ruins. No food, no mercy, just survival. As the winter deepened, Soviet forces launched a massive counter-offensive, Operation Uranus. They surrounded the German Sixth Army, trapping over 300,000 Axis troops inside the ruins. With no supplies and no way out, the Germans slowly collapsed from cold, hunger, and relentless Soviet attacks. In January 1943, General Paulus surrendered, the first German field marshal in history to do so. Hitler was furious, but it was already over. The Germans had lost more than a battle. They'd lost momentum on the Eastern Front. The death toll? Staggering. Over 2 million killed, wounded, or missing. Soldiers and civilians alike. Stalingrad didn't just bleed, it was bled dry. It remains one of the bloodiest battles ever fought, a turning point in World War II, and a chilling reminder of what happens when war becomes personal. The Battle of the Somme, 1916. On the first day, 20,000 British soldiers died before lunch. The generals called it strategy. History called it a massacre. In the summer of 1916, the green fields of northern France were transformed into a nightmarish wasteland. The Battle of the Somme was supposed to break the stalemate of World War I, to finally push the Germans out of their trenches and change the course of the war. Instead, it became a blueprint for how not to fight one. The plan was simple on paper. British and French forces would launch a massive attack along the Somme River to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. For a week before the assault, Allied artillery hammered German positions. Over 1.5 million shells were fired, meant to obliterate enemy defenses. But underground, the Germans waited. Their bunkers were deep, fortified, and largely untouched by the barrage. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, whistles blew. Thousands of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and walked, yes, walked, toward the German lines, confident the artillery had done its job. It hadn't. German machine guns opened fire. The fields became a killing zone. By the end of the first day, more than 57,000 British soldiers were casualties. Over 20,000 were dead. The bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. And that was just the beginning. For 5 more months, the battle dragged on. Trenches filled with mud, blood, and broken bodies. Shell fire was constant. Rain turned the land into a swamp. Horses drowned. Men disappeared. Whole villages were erased from the map. There were moments of gain, a few hundred yards here, a shell hole captured there, but never enough to justify the cost. When the battle finally ended in November 1916, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The Allied forces had advanced just 6 miles. The Battle of the Somme didn't break the stalemate. It didn't change the war, but it did change history by exposing the brutal futility of industrial-scale warfare and leaving behind a legacy of loss that Europe would carry for generations. The Siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944. This wasn't just a battle. It was slow-motion starvation. A city turned into a coffin. When German forces encircled the Soviet city of Leningrad in September 1941, they weren't just trying to conquer it, they were trying to erase it. Hitler's orders were clear. Cut off the city, don't waste bullets, let the people inside starve to death. And that's exactly what happened. For 872 days, Leningrad was trapped in a frozen chokehold. No food, no fuel, no escape. More than 2.5 million people, including over 400,000 children, were sealed inside. Factories shut down, water froze. The power went out. In the brutal Russian winters, temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Bread rations fell to less than a slice per day. People ate glue, wallpaper paste, rats, even their pets. When that wasn't enough, they turned on each other. Eyewitnesses recalled finding corpses stripped of flesh. Children were warned not to stray too far from their families because cannibalism had become an open secret. Entire apartment blocks were wiped out by hunger and cold before a single bomb ever fell. But bombs did fall. German artillery pounded the city daily. Hospitals were hit. Schools were leveled. And through it all, the citizens refused to surrender. Factories continued producing weapons, often by candlelight. The famous Road of Life, a supply route carved across the frozen Lake Ladoga, brought food and supplies under constant enemy fire. Drivers risked their lives every night crossing the cracking ice. By the time the siege was lifted in January 1944, over 1 million civilians were dead, more than the combined deaths of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet somehow the city held. The siege of Leningrad wasn't just one of the longest and deadliest sieges in history. It was a testament to how much suffering a population can endure without breaking. It wasn't won with guns. It was survived with sheer human will. The Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. Hannibal didn't just win. He orchestrated a kill zone so perfect, it became the stuff of military legend. In the heat of an Italian summer, the Roman Republic marched more than 80,000 soldiers to crush an enemy they thought they could overwhelm by sheer numbers. That enemy was Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general who had already crossed the Alps with elephants and humiliated Rome twice. But what he did at Cannae wasn't just a victory. It was surgical slaughter. The Romans, confident and eager for revenge, formed a massive block of infantry, tight, deep, and built to smash anything in its path. Hannibal, outnumbered, arranged his smaller force in a crescent, with his weakest troops in the center. It looked like a mistake. It wasn't. As the Roman juggernaut charged forward, it pushed into the center of Hannibal's line, exactly as he'd planned. While the Romans were busy breaking through what they thought was a collapsing front, Hannibal's elite African infantry swung in from the sides. At the same time, his cavalry, having defeated the Roman horsemen, circled around and hit from behind. In less than an hour, the Romans were completely surrounded, trapped in a ring of steel and spears. There was no escape. Men were crushed, stabbed, suffocated, trampled. The battle became a slaughterhouse. Ancient historians say the killing went on for hours, until bodies piled up so high that soldiers slipped on the blood of the fallen. The sun set on a battlefield where as many as 70,000 Romans lay dead. Only a handful escaped. Cannae wasn't just a defeat, it was psychological warfare. Rome had never suffered such a loss. Entire legions were erased. Senators wept in public. For a moment, it looked like the Republic might fall, but it didn't. Rome would survive. Hannibal wouldn't march on the capital, but the tactics he used that day, to lure, encircle, and destroy, became a gold standard in military history. The Battle of Cannae is still studied in war colleges across the world. Because on that day, on that blood-soaked plain, Hannibal didn't just outfight the Romans, he outthought them. The Battle of Antietam, 1862. One sunrise, one cornfield, 12 hours of horror, and 22,000 bodies lying where they fell. By the morning of September 17, 1862, two massive armies faced each other near the quiet town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. On one side stood the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee. On the other, the Union Army of the Potomac, under George B. McClellan. What followed would be the bloodiest single day in American military history. The first shots were fired just after dawn in a cornfield. That field would become a death trap. As Union troops surged forward, Confederate soldiers hidden among the tall stalks opened fire. The cornfield changed hands 15 times in just a few hours. Men were mowed down in rows. Soldiers described the ground as so thick with bodies that you couldn't take a step without stumbling on the dead or dying. Then came the sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane. Confederate troops took cover in a shallow dirt road, turning it into a natural trench. Union forces charged again and again, only to be gunned down in waves. When the Union finally broke through, The road was so clogged with corpses that you could walk across without touching dirt. In the afternoon, the battle shifted to Burnside's Bridge, where Union forces attempted to cross a narrow stone bridge under constant fire from sharpshooters perched on the bluffs above. For hours, the Union couldn't move. Bodies piled up on the bridge until it looked more like a wall of flesh than a crossing point. By sunset, the fields were silent. Smoke hung low, and over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Strategically, the battle was a draw, but it forced Lee to retreat back into the South, giving the Union a much-needed morale boost. More importantly, it gave President Abraham Lincoln the political momentum to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the purpose of the Civil War from saving the Union to ending slavery. Antietam wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was a massacre with a message. One day, one battlefield, a nation's future rewritten in blood. The Battle of Okinawa, 1945. By the end, the air smelled of rot and gunpowder. Civilians jumped off cliffs. Soldiers refused to surrender. In April 1945, as World War II neared its violent end, the United States launched its final and bloodiest assault in the Pacific, the Battle of Okinawa. This wasn't just another island campaign. Okinawa was seen as the gateway to mainland Japan, and both sides knew what was at stake. The battle began with a massive amphibious landing. American troops expected fierce resistance on the beaches, but found almost nothing. The silence wasn't mercy, it was a trap. Japanese forces had pulled back into an intricate web of caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges. They waited for the Americans to move inland, and then unleashed hell. Rain turned the terrain into mud. Artillery never stopped. Kamikaze pilots slammed into U.S. ships by the hundreds, sinking or damaging more than 30 vessels. On land, every hill was a blood-soaked climb. The most infamous, Hacksaw Ridge, where soldiers fought hand-to-hand, inch by inch, in one of the most savage displays of resistance in the war. And this time, it wasn't just soldiers caught in the crossfire. The island was home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Terrified and misinformed, many were told by Japanese propaganda that American soldiers would torture or kill them. Entire families jumped from cliffs or committed suicide rather than be captured. The Japanese military, refusing to surrender, fought to the last man. Some units launched banzai charges, hopeless, suicidal attacks, even after their commanders had fallen. The U.S. Marines and Army suffered heavily, but they kept advancing. By the end, over 12,000 American troops were dead, and nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers had been wiped out. But the civilian toll was the most heartbreaking. An estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians lost their lives, many of them intentionally killed by their own military or driven to suicide. When the island finally fell in June, the U.S. command looked at the cost and realized what an invasion of mainland Japan would mean. Okinawa directly influenced the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Battle of Okinawa wasn't just a victory, it was a warning, a glimpse of a war that had gone too far to be won cleanly, and one of the last chapters in a story written in fire, steel, and grief. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, a turning point soaked in blood, where brother killed brother and a hill became a tomb. In July 1863, the rolling hills of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, became the unlikely stage for the most famous and bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. For 3 straight days, the Union and Confederate armies clashed in a conflict that would shape the future of the United States. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had invaded the North, hoping to strike a crushing blow on Union territory and possibly force a peace. The Union Army, under General George Meade, stood in his path. What followed was chaos and carnage. Day 1 saw Confederate forces push Union troops back through the town. Houses were turned into hospitals. Streets were filled with gunfire and screams. Civilians hid in their basements as musket balls shattered windows above. On Day 2, the battle intensified. Fights broke out across places now etched into American memory: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield. Soldiers engaged in brutal close quarters combat, bayonets, and rifle butts colliding in a frenzy of survival. But it was Day 3 that sealed Gettysburg's place in history. Lee ordered a direct assault on the Union Center, a move now known as Pickett's Charge. 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched across an open field, straight into artillery fire. Within minutes, the line began to break. Men were torn apart by cannon blasts. Whole units were obliterated before they reached the Union line. Those who did were quickly overwhelmed. By the time the smoke cleared, over 50,000 soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, nearly a third of all troops involved. The South never fully recovered. Gettysburg marked the beginning of the Confederacy's slow decline, and a year later, President Abraham Lincoln would return to the battlefield to deliver the Gettysburg Address, redefining the war as a fight not just for unity, but for equality. The Battle of Gettysburg wasn't just a military event. It was a national reckoning, a moment when the country stood on the edge of collapse and held, but at a cost that would haunt it for generations. The Battle of Verdun, 1916. They called it the Furnace. Men went in. They didn't come out. In early 1916, the German High Command launched a plan not just to defeat the French, Mayos, but to destroy them through exhaustion. The idea was simple and horrifying. Draw French forces into a narrow killing zone and bleed them dry. The place they chose? Verdun. Verdun wasn't just a fortress. It was a symbol. An old medieval city surrounded by a ring of forts, seen by the French as sacred ground. The Germans knew its fall would be a psychological catastrophe, so they attacked with overwhelming force. What followed was a battle of attrition unlike anything the world had seen. The shelling began in February. Over 1 million artillery shells rained down in just the first few days. Forests were erased. Hills were flattened. Men were buried alive in trenches that vanished under fire. Soldiers called it the Hell of Verdun, a battlefield without rest, without shelter, without hope. French General Philippe Pétain, tasked with holding the line, vowed, "They shall not pass." And they didn't, but they also didn't retreat. The French cycled troops in and out continuously. The infamous Sacred Way. A single road kept running 24/7, delivering men and ammunition to the front while trucks dodged shell craters and corpses. The fighting was relentless. Trenches turned to mud pits. Gas attacks and flamethrowers added new horrors. Men fought for yards, not miles. Forts like Douaumont and Vaux changed hands again and again, each time leaving hundreds dead in the rubble. By the time the battle ended in December, after 10 months of continuous combat, more than 700,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The front line had barely moved. Verdun wasn't about territory. It was about endurance. It became the ultimate test of national will, where France chose to suffer rather than fall. The trauma of Verdun shaped a generation. It scarred the land, the people, and the soul of Europe. It wasn't just one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. It was a glimpse into how far humanity could go in its quest to win, and how much it was willing to lose. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like my content, then please hit like button and subscribe to my channel for more historical knowledge. Until then, goodbye.